Hello and welcome to our training video on recording medieval buckles onto the Portable Antiquities Scheme database. We'll start this video by recommending some books that will help you in your recording of medieval buckles. One of the most useful books is Dress Accessories by Egan and Pritchard. It covers buckles, brooches, strap ends, pins and other accessories for the medieval period up to 1450, with reliable archaeological dates based on coins and pottery. Similarly, the Ottaway and Rogers book on finds from York has good dated context too, and it provides a useful comparison to the finds from London, because things sometimes differed in the provinces. The Margeson volume on Norwich finds also contains a good variety of finds from well-dated contexts and is easy to use. Finally, the Meals volume is based on unstratified finds from the site of Meals in the Wirral, but suggested dates are backed up by evidence from other sites. It also has a useful classification of single loop buckles in it. There are of course many more books on the subject, but these are the most commonly used by our finds liaison officers and have proven the most useful. Now let's turn to the buckles themselves. After coins, buckles are the commonest medieval finds recorded on the database. It's most likely that they were lost by accident while travelling or working in the fields. The buckles we'll talk about will originally have been on belts. Here you can see a picture of some hanging up on a 14th century market stall. In the medieval period they might well have been called girdles instead. Both words are Anglo-Saxon in origin. Girth is the Old Norse equivalent of girdle, and we still use this for horses' belts. The guild which was responsible for regulating the manufacture of buckles and other strap fittings was called the Girdlers' Guild, and we have a lot of documents from the 14th century and later showing what the regulations were and the names for the different strap fittings. These regulations were supposed to hold throughout England, and the guild employed officials to go around the country and check that the quality was being maintained. There were also other girdlers' guilds in York, Coventry and Norwich at least, and maybe in most cities. There is also some evidence that members of the Founders Company produced buckles, as founders worked in cast metal, but it's possible that these were for horse harnesses or weaponry rather than for dress items. We're not going to cover horse harness buckles in this video, but will instead concentrate on those that we think were worn by humans. In terms of documentary evidence, we also have the Sumptuary Law of 1363. This is a really strange law that was quickly repealed and probably never made any difference to what was really worn, but it shows how dress accessories were regarded in the 14th century. You weren't supposed to wear silver on your belt unless you were an esquire with an income of at least £500 a year. If you weren't an esquire but just an ordinary citizen, your income had to be at least £1,000 per year. We don't find many silver buckles, strap ends or mounts from this period, but there are a couple shown here. We have lots of gilded copper alloy buckles, but amazingly still not a single gold one from the medieval period. The Sumptuary Law also stipulated that labourers should wear linen girdles, and in fact we find quite a bit of textile surviving when it's been sandwiched between copper alloy plates. This is because the copper corrosion is toxic, so it kills off the bacteria which would otherwise rot the textile. 2 of these have been found in York and have been analysed. One was linen, but surprisingly the other was silk. It's difficult to distinguish between textile types without analysis, so when recording just call it textile rather than linen, wool, silk, etc. We can't really get any sense of which buckles and strap fittings were worn by women and which by men. We have got some effigies and brasses, but firstly, these only show the very richest people in their best clothes, and secondly, often the buckles that we suspect were there are hidden beneath cloaks and overdresses. There are a very few graves with buckles in them, and from these it has been suggested that women may have worn narrower belts than men, but this is very tentative, and at present we simply don't know if there was any difference in what men and women wore in terms of belts or girdles. We also don't know in most cases which buckles were part of dress and which were from spurs or harnesses or bags and satchels, sword harnesses, shield straps, quivers, shoes, or even on straps fastening chests and boxes. Since we are unsure of the exact function of most buckles, the object type will be buckle, rather than say belt buckle. So type buckle into your object type field. Now we're going to move on to what we call the various parts of the buckle and the terminology to use when recording them onto the PAS database. We'll start with the individual components. A buckle has to have a frame and a pin. It can also have a plate. The plate is normally attached to the strap with rivets. Regardless of whether you have a complete buckle or just the frame, plate or pin, use the object type buckle. There is an object type on the database for pin, but this is not to be used for buckle pins since they are components of a buckle and not objects in their own right. Don't use the classification field to flag up the elements of the buckle that are present, frame, plate or pin, as this will be used occasionally for the type of buckle that you are recording. In general, the PAS has always followed the conventions from Egan and Pritchard's book, and for buckles of all dates, not just the medieval ones. The first major division is between single loop and double loop buckles. The word loop is difficult to define, but it can be thought of as the space within the buckle frame. Shown here are some varieties of single loop and double loop buckle frames. Let's start with the single loop buckles. Here are 6 common frame shapes and words you can use for describing them in your database records. Sometimes the distinction between the shapes is hard to make, but on the whole, D-shaped should be used for those buckle frames with sharply right-angled corners, and oval for those with more rounded corners. Incidentally, a buckle frame will be assumed to be a single loop unless stated otherwise, so all of these can simply be described as oval buckle frame or rectangular buckle frame. Shapes can be different internally and externally. The one pictured on the left is easy to describe in just a few words, but the one on the right needs more description as neither triangular nor lozenge shaped is quite right. We'd probably say that it flares out externally from the bar, then turns a sharp, almost right-angled corner before tapering again to form a pointed outside edge. This image shows the correct terminology for the different parts of a single loop buckle. The area which holds the pin is called the bar. The bar would normally hold the strap as well, as shown top right, although since the strap is usually made of an organic material, it rarely survives. The rest of the frame can be divided into various parts as follows: the top edge, bottom edge, and outside edge. The term outside edge is used for the part of the buckle frame opposite the bar. The top and bottom edges are often very similar, but if you have a buckle where they are different, then make sure you tell the reader which way you've oriented your buckle before you start the detailed description. This is generally a good tip for all objects, not just buckles. These examples are more elaborate, but all on the same basic oval or D-shaped frame. Variations in design can include offset bars, bars with lobes on either end, pointed pin rests, thicker or ornate outside edges. An ornate outside edge will need a full description. The pin rest is the area on the outside edge opposite where the pin is hinged and where the tip of the pin rests, hence the name. It's quite common to have a pointed and/or grooved pin rest, as shown here in the examples at the top of the slide. You'll need to distinguish between a pointed pin rest, where there is a prominent point in the centre of the outside edge, as shown top left, and a pointed outside edge, where the whole of the edge expands to the point, as shown top right. The outside edge might also have a constriction for a separate sheet roller, as shown at the bottom of the slide. Now let's turn to double loop buckles. Double loop buckles become fashionable later than single loop ones. In London, almost all double loop buckles come from the late 14th or 15th century contexts, and this form continues into the post-medieval period. Generally, we describe double loop buckles by the shape of the loops. So for example, the buckle pictured top left would be a double loop buckle frame, both loops rectangular and of equal size, bar projecting slightly beyond frame. Whereas the one next to it would be a double loop buckle frame, both loops oval, centre of the bar slightly narrowed. Each loop is widened and angled with a grooved pin rest. Occasionally, it's easier to describe a double loop buckle frame as a whole by starting with the basic outline shape and then saying that they have a central bar, as with the examples pictured in the bottom right. So you might say it was a circular buckle frame with a central bar rather than a double loop buckle frame, both loops semicircular with a central bar. It's just a bit quicker. Some double loop buckle frames are asymmetric, so the loops are of different shapes, as with the examples pictured here. Make sure you describe both of the loops thoroughly. For double loop buckles, the strap is usually wrapped around the bar and stitched in place, with a slot cut for the pin, as shown here on the left. Occasionally it can be wrapped around one of the edges, in which case the strap doesn't need to be cut for the pin, as shown on the right. Now moving on to pins. We don't have very many detached buckle pins on the database. Maybe they disintegrate, or they simply aren't recognised once they come off the buckle. But there are a few examples pictured here. The parts of the pin are the loop and the shaft. Cast pins often have a ridge or a raised rectangular panel at the junction of the shaft and the loop. You can use the word moulding for this, but do describe it fully as moulding isn't very precise. Cast pins can have a closed or open loop, as shown here on the right. Pins can also be made of wire or sheet metal. These are bent around the frame as shown, leaving an open loop. They are found on a variety of frames from simple to quite elaborate. When a pin is made from sheet or wire and the frame is cast, often a different composition of metal is used. You might get more lead in an alloy for casting and more copper in an alloy for cold working, hammering and bending. You can see slightly different colours of metal pictured here. A mismatch between frame and pin might of course also be due to a replacement pin, but we can't as a rule distinguish between an original pin that's been made using a different technique and a replacement pin. Moving on to plates, there are two types of plate, the hinged plate, which is made separately, and the integral plate, which is made in one piece with the frame. Both are shown here on the left. We'll start off with the hinged plates, and the parts of a hinge plate are shown here on the right. A hinged plate usually has a pin slot cut out for the pin, and cut-out corners known as frame recesses. The part where the plate is folded around the bar is known as the fold, and the part of the plate that is underneath the strap is the underplate or backplate. There will also be a way to fix the strap to the plate. These are rivets and will either be separate rivets or integral, where they are made in one piece with the rest of the plate. If the rivets are integral to the rest of the plate, you don't need to mention the material because it will be the same as the plate. If the rivets are separate, you must confirm the material, even if it is the same as that of the plate. You also have the pin slot, frame recesses and the hinge loops as shown. Not all buckle plates will have frame recesses, as shown in the example on the bottom right. Most hinged plates will have a slot for the pin. However, there are a few unusual examples where the pin is held in a pinhole instead. The diagram on the right shows how these two different types were manufactured. Occasionally, we can use evidence from the frame itself to show that it originally had a hinged plate but has lost it. So sometimes you get two wear points on the bar, as shown at the top here. In other cases, it seems that the bar was made to have a bump in the centre where the pin hinged, presumably to retain the plate in position to either side. Keep an eye out for clues like this when you are recording buckles. Moving on to integral plates. An integral plate has to have a pinhole. A lot of physical stress gets put on integral plates, and so they are often used for specific functions where they don't have to bend too much. We'll look at these in more detail later when we get onto specific types. Plates can be a variety of shapes, and here are just a few. If the plate is rectangular, it helps to state whether the rectangle is short, with the longer axis parallel to the bar, or long, with the longer axis perpendicular to the bar. These long integral buckle plates can be very complicated shapes and take a lot of describing. Now we will look at how we take the measurements of buckles. For buckles, the length is not always the longest measurement. We need to be able to distinguish between different shapes, such as these two on the left here, which both have the same measurements. So we always take the width across the width of the strap, and we always take the length parallel to the pin, in fact along the length of the strap. This way we always compare like with like. The other tricky thing is how to quote the overall dimensions when you have more than one component. If you have a frame with a pin and/or with a plate, then you'll need to give the measurements of each component separately in the description field, but for the dimension fields, you will need to give the total length. We're now going to go on to talk about the different types of buckles that were used in the medieval period. We're going to divide it up into three sections: everyday cheap buckles, which are common, expensive luxury buckles, which we don't record so many of, and buckles that appear to have a specialist use. We'll start with the everyday cheap buckles, which are the commonest type that we record. They also form the vast majority of buckles from excavated contexts, particularly the big urban assemblages like London, York, Winchester, Colchester, Exeter and Norwich, which all have good accessible publications written about them. The first thing to note is that there are very few everyday buckle types that we can as yet date to the 12th century, and at present we have very little hard evidence to go on. The type shown in the top left is dated to the 11th century on the basis of its links to late Viking art styles. It's basically derived from the Ringerike style, but there are hints that it may continue into the 12th century. It occurs in excavated medieval contexts occasionally. We record it at present as early medieval. The only certainly 12th century well-known simple buckle type is the one pictured middle and top right, with a more Romanesque looking animal head at either end of the bar. Quite often it has no other decoration, but some of the better made ones have one side of the frame ribbed with oblique grooves, and sometimes there's also a grooved pin rest. These are known from late 11th and 12th century contexts in Norwich and Winchester, so we have good archaeological dates for this style, and the examples from Norwich and Winchester are pictured here at the bottom. So this type starts in the late 11th century and continues into the 12th century. The reason why there are so few everyday buckles well dated to the 12th century is probably because 12th century contexts in major towns are few, and so there aren't that many easily accessible big data sets to look at. Also, there may possibly have been a fashion for knotting belts rather than buckling them. It may be that small simple buckle frames are common in the 12th century, but we find them hard to recognise, or that some of our 13th century types start in the 12th century. For now, we have to make do with dating buckles on art historical grounds, despite some of the problems that this poses. The big expansion in buckle use comes in the late 12th or early 13th century, with a huge rise in the number and variety of small, simple everyday buckles. They tend to be D-shaped or oval or circular. These offset or narrowed bars are characteristic. Pointed pin rests are also found in these late 12th to 14th century buckles. We also get these wide outside edges that Egan and Pritchard call ornate. But although these start in the late 12th century in London, they seem to start later in the north. In York, Ottaway and Rogers say that they begin in the mid-13th century. Oddly, from archaeological evidence, rectangular buckle frames don't appear to come into fashion until the 14th century, and maybe even the late 14th century. Even these simple ones aren't found in the 12th and 13th centuries. Other buckle types that are mainly 14th century include these D-shaped ones with the rounded knobs, which can be made in sets with strap slides. Strap slides are what the end of the strap is slid through after it's gone through the buckle. They date from the late 12th to the late 14th centuries. The type with pairs of internal projections, shown here in the middle, is the earliest, then the others are 13th or 14th century. So we get very similar buckles and strap slides, presumably worn together on a single strap. It's thought that these were highly arched to accommodate mounts on the strap. Another kind of buckle that seems to be confined to the 14th century is the annular buckle, a large cast circular frame with a thick cast copper alloy pin. Now this is very like an annular brooch. It can be difficult to decide whether you have a buckle or brooch in front of you when it comes to this type. The general rule that was set by Egan and Pritchard is this: if a circular frame has a constriction to hold the pin in place, it's a brooch, and if it doesn't, it's a buckle. Egan and Pritchard use evidence from the Battlefield Cemetery at Visby on Gotland, where similar items are used to buckle straps on armour, and they also point out that these very chunky pins wouldn't easily go through fabric. These two sword belts on 14th century effigies possibly show this kind of buckle, but it's not buckling armour. These buckles are, very unusually, occasionally found in graves, sometimes in pairs at the top of the femurs. Where identifiable, the bones have been those of men. British examples are mainly from monastic graveyards, and so it's also been suggested that they buckled monks' habits. However, again, it seems there is no pictorial evidence for this. The illustrations of monks' habits that we've managed to find never show a belt. Both of these theories cannot be right because monks don't fight in battle and soldiers don't get buried in their armour in churchyards. So there's one further theory, that they are in both monastic graves and soldiers' graves because they were used to fasten hose to a belt, fixed to straps in a sort of suspender belt arrangement. There's a fascinating article on these written in the 1950s by Frances Russell Smith, and she goes into a good deal of detail about medieval men's undergarments. She does cite various pictorial sources, mainly the Luttrell Psalter. It's hard to see exactly what's going on here, but the hose seem to be held up by this circular item, possibly attached to a strap that isn't illustrated. And these kind of underpants were apparently held up in the absence of elastic by being wrapped over and tucked into a belt, which may also have held the straps. This was very convincing until Eleanor Stanley re-examined the pictorial evidence and concluded that there were no clear buckles on these pictures at all. She also points out that such large buckles would have been uncomfortable on underwear. Instead, she suggests that they were either used to buckle whatever's holding these pants up at the waist, which is never seen in the pictures because the pants are tucked into them, or, to complete the circle, she adds that they may also have been used on the belt fastening the monastic habit. So no one can explain their presence in graves, unless they were the only buckle in fashion for a brief moment when belts were put in graves. They do always seem to date from the 14th century, probably the late 14th century. There is a good stratified example from a late 14th or early 15th century context in Winchester, and 2 from York. And in fact, more are turning up in non-monastic cemeteries too. It seems that they were found at monasteries mainly because those were the only medieval graveyards that were available for excavation. Now that there's been so much archaeology in medieval towns with bombed or burnt out churches, we have places like the Black Death Cemetery of East Smithfield, excavated in the 1980s, which produced several of these buckles. The cast pins on these large chunky buckles often have pins with the tip worn or cut away on the underside to allow them to sit nicely on the frame. It's worth checking these carefully for any tool marks which may show whether they are deliberately made or have simply worn to this shape. Continuing with our buckle timeline, there are several more types that begin in the 14th century and continue into the 15th, such as these trapezoidal buckles. This type with integral plate is the same kind of date, 14th and 15th century. They normally have a pointed pin rest area, similar to oval buckle frames of the 13th and 14th century, with offset bars, and must have developed out of this design. They are known as composite buckles, and matching composite strap ends are also common. We put the word composite in the classification field. Fragments of these are extremely common. They're quite complex in their construction. The oval frame is cast in one piece with these big prongs, which are known as the forked spacer. Then a pair of thin plates are soldered onto the spacer, and it's these plates that have the rivet holes to attach the buckle plate to the strap. You can see the rivet holes here, and here also is the textile strap still held on by its rivet. The fragments are reasonably easy to recognise, at least some of them are. The forked spacers are very distinctive. Often you can see solder on both faces, as shown here on the left. The plates can be recognised by the decorative shaping on their attachment edges. It can be difficult to know if the plate is from a strap end or a buckle. In general, those from buckles have straight edges next to the frame, whereas those from strap ends have rounded or pointed edges at their closed ends. It can be difficult to tell which end is which, of course, but the rivets are generally at the attachment end. Composite buckles with forked spacers are well known all over England in the 14th century, but they seem to carry on into the 15th century, especially in the north of England. There are lots from 15th century contexts in York, but they all have undecorated plates without the hole at the attachment end, so perhaps look more like those shown here. They have a tendency to be more circular and with a less pointed pin rest. It's occasionally possible to get one with a rectangular or trapezoidal frame, which one might expect as this is when trapezoidal frames without plates are becoming more popular. As we get to the end of the 14th century, belts get wider. The very narrow straps that were so common in the 13th and 14th century really decline in numbers. In the 15th century, we get lots of double-looped buckle frames. These are very occasionally found in earlier contexts, as we have seen, but they really get going in the 15th century. There's a big variety of rectangular, D-shaped and oval loops. They are larger and have more decoration too. Most of these types seem to run on into the 16th century. The rose-shaped one, shown in the top left, is particularly nice as it always has 5 petals, and so may allude to the Tudor dynasty because their badge was a 5-pointed rose. So that's a very quick run-through of the common everyday buckles from the 13th to the 15th centuries. Very roughly, it goes oval buckle frames, which are then joined by rectangular buckles. Then composite buckles become the most common, with a few trapezoidal frames. Then double loop buckles of all shapes. Now we're going to move on to luxury buckles. More expensive buckles may well have a shorter life because high fashion moves more quickly than everyday utilitarian clothing. And they may also be more widespread, even international, because elites tend to move in less intensely local circles. To start with, we're going to go back to the 12th century, because although there are very few diagnostic everyday buckles from this time, there are some types of beautifully decorated buckles to enjoy. They split into two categories: the kind that looks back to the late Anglo-Saxon period and has animal art, and the kind that looks forward to new developments. This is kind of what we might expect in the 12th century, where there are huge changes going on. We'll start with the older looking ones with animal art. We saw that the commonest everyday 12th century buckle had animal heads at the end of the bar, perhaps gripping the ends of the bar in their mouths, and that these have good 11th and 12th century dates from archaeological finds in Norwich and Winchester. Other 12th century buckles are normally dated from the appearance of the animals, compared with well-dated Romanesque animal carvings in 12th century churches. But this can be dangerous because there often isn't anything very diagnostic about these animals. An example of a luxury buckle that has been dated to the 12th century is the gaping mouth beast buckles. These were collected and published by Stephen Ashley and Andrew Rogerson in Medieval Archaeology for 2011, and we now have about 40 on the database. There aren't any from archaeological contexts, so the dating is entirely through the style of the object. They can be difficult to record because they are very three-dimensional and so can be hard to photograph. Also, it's often difficult to understand how the strap was fixed, and in fact there are two types. One has the pin hinged in a hole under the animal head, and the pin rests on the outside edge. The second type has the pin hinged on the bar with its tip resting on the top of the animal head. This example is clearly related to later 13th century buckles because of its oval shape with offset bar. Use gaping mouth beast in the classification field for both types to flag these up. Here is another type that has been identified as 12th century, again with an animal, and again dated on the basis of what the animal looks like. We have at least 20 of these on the database, including these two which have pins, proving that they were used as buckles. At present, we are putting standing animal in the classification field for these. They are very widespread, from Northumbria to Devon, from the Welsh border to East Anglia. These two types of animal buckle don't appear to continue beyond the end of the 12th century, but with the caveat that these are only dated by their art. Now we're going to move on to types of buckle plate that are currently thought to be 12th century, but look forward to types found largely in the 13th century. We'll start with the one pictured here. So far, there are none recorded on the PAS which have a frame, only a plate. It has a cast openwork element riveted to a sheet backplate which includes the hinge loops. Most are extremely similar and very recognisable even when they have lost the backplate and don't really look much like a buckle. This type has been dated to the 12th century on the basis of the animal head, just like the two preceding types. This is slightly problematic because there isn't a lot of change to these fairly small and simple animal heads over the centuries. Luckily in this case there are some excavated parallels. Firstly, there's the one pictured top left, from a late 13th century context in Canterbury, but has been thought of as being old when buried, so late 12th to early 13th century is feasible for this type. Also shown are some variants of the type. We don't, however, have a good name for this kind of buckle yet, so we instead quote the Marlow car park example with its number F655 in the object description field, so if we need to search for all examples, we can just do a search for F655. Don't put this in the classification field though, because it's not a proper name. Put it in the object description. Next we have a square example, again with a cast openwork element on top of a sheet backplate. We have these lovely buckles, one from Bedfordshire and one from Norfolk. A decorated backplate, which might be from another one, was found again in Norfolk. The decoration on the backplate suggests a 13th century date, and the collets here, which have lost their settings, might suggest a 13th or 14th century date. This is confirmed by examples excavated from 13th or 14th century contexts at Stafford and Winchester. We're now going to look at another type which starts in the 12th century and continues for a while. These are the high-status buckles that were made in the metalworking and enamelling workshops of Limoges in France. Limoges was part of Aquitaine, and so its overlord was the English king Henry II, who married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152. It was constantly fought over until about 1300 when the French finally won, but during this time, a century and a half, the market for Limoges-style objects really flourished in England. The buckles seem to have been made from about 1200 onwards, and are really only identified by their decoration. Otherwise they look like any other oval buckle frame. The outside edge is widened and sometimes angled to give space for the decoration. This group is interesting. As you can see, a group of double loop buckles dated to the early 13th century, which is remarkably early for a double loop buckle. The plate is folded around the smaller loop, meaning that there is no need for a pin slot, so it can be hard to spot the detached plates. If you have a quick look back at the everyday loop buckle, then you can see that a hallmark of these early double loop buckles is that the strap or plate is fixed to one of the loops rather than to the central bar, as is the norm later on. The hallmark of the Limoges workshop is that the colours of enamel are not separated by metal lines, as you can see here, particularly with the blue and white. But as, a lot of the time, actually none of the enamel survives, we needn't be too precious about this. Also, we expect that some of the less well executed pieces were probably made in England in imitation of the Limoges style, but we needn't worry too much about exact provenance. They are Limoges style, not necessarily direct from Limoges itself. Put Limoges style in the classification field. Incidentally, some of these enamelled buckle plates are easy to confuse with square harness pendant suspension mounts. You can tell them apart because the mounts are generally a bit smaller and have more standardised decoration. The same basic shape of Limoges buckles was also used for relief decoration, and here are a few examples. These buckle plates are also thought to be late 12th to 13th century, but there's no archaeological evidence at all to back this up. They are either M-shaped or bird-shaped, it's hard to tell which. They tend to break, but the fragments are reasonably easy to identify. These seem at the moment to be confined to Eastern England. This is unusual for a medieval object. It looks more like an early Anglo-Saxon distribution map, but do look out for them because it would be good to know if this is a real pattern or not. When these are found still attached to frames, they are always rectangular frames, which, on their own you'll remember, don't appear in urban archaeological contexts until the 14th century. This is at present a bit of a puzzle and needs more work. It's possible that rectangular frames came in on these more luxury buckles and then spread a century or so later to everyday simple buckles. Other rectangular frames can be found with plates with fleur-de-lis terminals, which again are thought to date to the 13th or 14th century. Now this is based on archaeological evidence from 3 buckles. There's one from Winchester in a mid-13th century context, one from London in a late 13th or early 14th century context, and one from Norwich in a 14th or early 15th century context. Here are a few other openwork buckles that again are thought perhaps to be of 12th to 13th century date. Although the everyday medieval buckles are rather samey, the luxury market developed a huge variety, and the dating of these is extremely difficult at the moment. Although we have masses of these very various decorated buckles on the PAS database, there are very few from dated archaeological contexts. There is therefore a lot of scope for research into 12th to 14th century buckles. Once we get towards the 15th century, we are on far firmer ground. Although this is the point at which everyday buckles become mainly double-looped, prestigious buckles stay with the single-looped form. We do, however, get a variety of loop shapes. This group is probably the best known, and it has a subtriangular frame and integral plate. For some reason, it has in the past been known as lyre-shaped, presumably because it bears a passing resemblance to the musical instrument. When writing object descriptions for the database, we try to avoid describing an object as looking like another object, so make sure you describe the shape fully, as well as referring to it as lyre-shaped. This shape is also used for strap ends, and because these hang down from the belt, they can be seen on occasional effigies and brasses, which are of course generally precisely dated with the date of death of the person depicted. These have been studied for a very long time, and dated to the brief time between 1390 and 1410, on the basis of effigies by Ward Perkins. We assume that the date of the buckles is pretty much the same, essentially very late 14th century and first half of 15th. There are other 15th and 16th century single loop buckles which have incurved outside edges too, such as those pictured here. You can call these kidney-shaped or B-shaped, but do please also describe them fully. Note the buckle in the top left, which has a black coating, which is very characteristic of all sorts of late 15th and early 16th century items, including things like purse bars. It's thought to result from applying linseed oil to the object when hot, and is one of the surface treatment options in the database drop-down. There are excavated parallels from London, again one with a separate bar here, and others from Norwich, which has a particularly clear chronology. But you need caution in using incurved outside edges for dating, as there are plenty of 13th and 14th century buckles which also have it, such as the example here on the left. There are plenty of parallels from excavations in London to show that incurved outer edges are occasionally fashionable well before the 15th century, so you can't rely on them as an indicator of date. There are also a few more ornate double-looped buckle frames that can look much later than the 15th century, but which do crop up in excavated contexts of that date. Here is one type, with examples from contexts in London and Norwich, and others from the PAS database. This is the kind of thing that develops into the standard 16th and 17th century buckle frame. Now we'll move on to buckles with a specialist function, starting off with the most common of the specialist buckles, those from spurs. In general, we identify spur buckles as having integral plates, like this one still in situ on its spur. It has a short rectangular integral plate with beveled edges and separate rivets. Here is the spur side, and the leathers are attached with these hook attachments, with the buckle riveted onto the leather on the other side of the foot. The drawing of a spur shows how it wraps around the foot. Until very recently, we thought that these started in the 13th century, but recent work by Rob Webley on 12th century material has suggested that there is a group of spur buckles that starts at least by the 12th century. They have this distinctive feature, a pinhole that sticks out a bit into the loop, and they are made in one piece with short tapering plates and integral rivets. They may be related to this one in the top right, with animal decoration that suggests an 11th century date. How long they carry on in use for is uncertain, but at least we know they have good 12th century dates. These ones shown bottom right from Winchester come from a late 11th to 12th century context and a 12th century context respectively. We have lots of other small buckles with integral plates on the PAS database, and a selection is shown here. These are all at roughly the same scale, and you can see that they are of varying sizes, with different shaped frames and with both integral and separate rivets. As you can see, they are very chunky and sturdy, just right for use on a spur. Buckles like these come from 13th to 14th century contexts in London. We also have other spurs with buckles with plates ending in hooks. Here is one found in London with the buckle still in place, with an example for the PAS database. Sometimes when the plates are a little longer, they curve a bit to fit better around the foot. Here are some more examples from the PAS database, and these are all good strong chunky buckles on the left side of this image. They shade into another group of presumably specialist buckles, again with hooked plates, but this time longer, thinner and flimsier. Then there are other very similar examples, but with riveted attachments rather than hooks at the ends of the plates. There are hundreds and hundreds of these on the database, with lots of variation, and perhaps they are not all spur buckles. Let's move back to another small kind of buckle, which has been suggested as a spur buckle by Ross Whitehead. These don't have a name at present. Some people call them keyhole buckles or crossbow buckles, but the best name for them is T-shaped buckles, as nearly all of them conform to a T-shape. So we put T-shaped in the classification field. They look very much like they were not attached to straps, and in fact a few have now been found attached to swivels, and it's been suggested that they may have been used on dogs' leads. This reminds us that it's not only humans and horses that wear straps with buckles, dogs and hawks may also have done so. One of these has also been found in Suffolk made from gilded silver, which is a surprise. It's pictured here on the right. Sumptuary law did not apply to dogs, it seems. Another type of buckle with a specialised use is that with a loop at either end. We don't have very many on the PAS database, and most of the excavated examples are iron with a tin coating, so they might have been used outdoors, perhaps on armour or on horse harnesses. They tend to be a bit bent, which might be also a clue. Although it looks as if there is a pinhole for each loop, there are never two surviving pins, and it seems as if the other hole is normally used for a second rivet. Excavated examples date to the late 13th or 14th century in London. Again, there is no decent name, and so you can search for them on the parallel number from Egan and Pritchard, number 488. The next buckle type we'd like to look at was an oddity for many years, but has now been properly researched by Tom Redmayne, and as a result we're on much firmer ground. This is the disc-on pin type. They are pretty homogeneous, only really differing in the form of the pin, as you can see here, and so that's how Tom has classified them. These were very confusing when first discovered, because they were thought to be brooches. If you look at this one in the centre, it has no bar and looks very much like an annular brooch, but it's impossible for it to work in the way that an annular brooch does, because the disc gets in the way. You can't get the pin through the fabric. It was eventually noted that some of them had slots in the reverse, like the two shown at the bottom, and after a while an explanation of this came when the brooch on the far right was recorded in 2005. It seems that a strap was threaded through and around the bar, but we have still not found any examples with a pin on the bar, and the 4 or so that we have with plates on the bar do not have any slot for a hole or a pin, so it seems very likely that the bars never had pins. It's quite possible that a simple threading of a strap through the bar was enough to retain whatever this buckle is being used for, but Tom also suggests an idea that the end of the strap could have been passed through the frame, securing the end of the pin in the hole and then pulling it tight to tension the strap. Then the strap can be bent back on itself and held down with the strap slide, as shown here. Of course, not all buckle solutions are sensible. Making the bar separately and slotting it into recesses is a ridiculously weak construction method, which indeed very often failed, and we don't have an explanation for why it was chosen. Fragments of these buckles can be difficult to identify unless you know what you're looking at. The pins are sometimes thought to be broken early post-medieval hooked tags, and occasionally the frames are thought to be from brooches because the slots on the reverse have been missed. We've now got nearly 200 of these on the PAS database. We record them as buckle in the object type field, with disc on pin in the classification field, and the red main type in the subclassification field. There is still no evidence for date apart from the objects themselves, so it's an educated guess, but Tom Redmayne has suggested 14th or 15th century. But they could be from the 12th century onwards. Another type of buckle that is a bit of a mystery is the so-called locking buckle. We now have almost 300 of this type on the database. They are made in 3 parts. There's a rectangular frame with holes at either side to take a separate bar. This has a long extension forming an arm ending in a globular terminal, usually decorated with curving grooves. On the bar is a pin consisting of a tube with a triangular projection. The pin is free to revolve around the bar, so what exactly happens when the arm is rotated to sit against this flattened flange here is a bit hard to work out. You can see the separate parts on the right of this image. A pin cast with a tube and a frame with holes at either side. The arm passes through the whole lot and holds it all together. They were called locking buckles by Ward Perkins in 1940, and so that's what we put in the classification field at the moment. There's also a variant which may be related. The buckles top left look like locking buckles, but without the flange at the outside edge. There is one of these published in Egan and Pritchard 1991 with a pin that is definitely not right for a locking buckle. It's shown here bottom left with a solid pin which definitely didn't extend out to form a locking arm. The other one, number 445 from London, came from a late 14th century context. The dating of locking buckles has been quoted as 14th century, possibly because of these variants. But if we can ignore these as not having the curved arm, do we have any other evidence for date? It's been suggested that they might be related to purse bars of type B3, shown here, bottom right, possibly on the grounds that they look a bit similar, and that the locking arm could have been used as a hook to suspend a purse. This would give them a date of early 16th century, and in fact there are 2 from 16th century contexts in London. This statue of St. Wash in the National Museum in Amsterdam shows what looks very much like a locking buckle. He isn't suspending a purse from it, so it appears as if it's functioning as a perfectly normal buckle, but it does give us a date of around AD 1500, as well as a clue to the right way up to photograph it. So we should say late 15th to early 16th century for these particular buckles. The last type of specialist buckle-like item we're going to look at is this one, a type that is occasionally found in medieval contexts, but continues at least into the 16th, if not into the 17th century. It's characterised by this third loop at the bottom. All the medieval examples so far have square or rectangular loops in the same plane as the rest of the buckle, as shown on the left here. Much commoner are the post-medieval ones that these develop into, which can have frames of varying shapes and circular loops at the bottom that are turned through 90 degrees. It's thought that these are for hanging sword scabbards from, and come into fashion with a great array of hooked and looped belt fittings, which mainly date to the 16th and 17th centuries. They haven't yet been found with pins, and so it's been suggested that they should be recorded as strap fittings and sword belt fittings rather than buckles. Although we have to say that we haven't completely made our mind up about this, and it's best to check the database and see what the latest ones have been recorded as. This brings us to the end of this introduction to recording medieval buckles on the PAS database. We'll finish by saying that there are also a lot of mystery medieval buckles that we often have to make educated guesses about. There's a huge amount of research that needs to be done on PAS buckles, and therefore enormous potential for discovering new information. If you need further help when identifying and recording buckles, ask your local finds liaison officer. You can also view our online guide to recording buckles at the web address shown here or through the link available in the video description.